So what's the first ingredient? Maybe we could see this a bit like a recipe. So the first ingredient, of course, is going to be the social impact. And that's where the social enterprise differs from any other business, because it's got that core social or environmental impact. So key issues around poverty. Crucially, in the last, I don't know if you've seen the last couple of days, the very important report on climate change coming out and the crucial role of social enterprise in tackling environmental issues. Also health issues, issues to do with instability, whole range of social impacts related to wide things, education and many other areas as well. And here, when you're looking at this ingredient, it's looking at what are your benefits, and you can break them down to the, not only the communities you're serving, but also sometimes people separate out the customers, where there's many social enterprises might be delivering services for one group to their customers, and then using that money to go into communities or other people in need. But we can also look at their impact on your employees as well. So it's not just about one of the big impacts of many social enterprises is employing people and supporting them. And then we can look at the wider benefits to your communities, what I call the social capital. As you having a big impact, not only are you having financial benefits, but you can also have the social benefits. So what I call the social capital, the networks, the connections, the opportunities that come about through those networks. And social enterprises are really good at creating those links. And that's been shown to be really vital in supporting particularly sort of more disadvantaged areas. How do you create those opportunities? How do you create the networks to get people out of it and out of poverty and out of disadvantage, and to support those areas? And then we can look at the wider areas that the social enterprises might be doing, and where you've got these innovations, but through having those innovations scaling up and reaching wider areas, the social enterprise might be doing a small amount on its own, but can have an impact around the world as your innovations might get spread or can support others to do things. So this is a vital ingredient of social impact. And therefore, if you're doing that, I would say that if you're, as any business might be looking at measuring its accounts and doing financial accounts, we've got to do the same for the social impact. So we've got to be able to measure our impact. And for this, when you're deciding what you measure, you've got to decide how much you put into it, how much money, how much time you can put into it, because it can be quite expensive or take a lot of time. But it's really important for two reasons. One is to prove to people what you're doing, and the other is to improve. So by measuring your impact, you can learn what works, what's less successful, how you can shift your resources to make that biggest social impact there. And I think particularly when you're looking at grant funders, they're often looking at how you can prove that their grant that they're giving you is having a big impact as well. So it's particularly important in the discussions for today. So the second ingredient, as I said, it's not only social impact, it's that business model. You've got to, for social enterprises to grow, and this is where they may be different from some NGOs, which might be completely reliant on grants. The social enterprises will have an element of a business model where they're earning some income as well. And this comes from selling great products or great services as well. So here are a few sort of examples of ones that I've been working in the past. So one is in the UK, a very nice social enterprise called Big Issue, where it's a magazine that's sold by homeless people, and they can take a share of the money from it in the magazine. And then it's run as a business, but they get the money. And they also have a lot of programs to take homeless people and give them training and health benefits so that they can get off the streets. The other element of a good business model is the issue of diversification. And I think we've seen that in the last 18 months. It's been such a difficult time around the world. And with the lockdown and the pandemic, it's those businesses that have diversification that are able to have something that if one business area is suffering, another bit can take over, or that they don't have to lose all of their income. And I think as you develop your social enterprise, you've got to think through what would happen if there is something closes, what would happen, how can we survive with having multiple different business models as well. So the next ingredient is having great people. So you've got to think through your employees, your volunteers, people who can, and then you need also not only people who are great at delivering their particular bit within the business. They might be, if you're a education related social enterprise, you not only do you need people who are great at education and great teachers, but you need people who can understand both the social impact and the business side as well. So how do you bring those skills together? And that's where social enterprises are different. It needs people who, when you're balancing both the social and the commercial, you need people and leaders as well who can bring it together. And that's where a leadership in social enterprise requires slightly different approaches to leadership in other organizations, because you've got to bring together these different skills, bring the business side and the social impact side together. And the other element of great people is creating what we call good work. You want to have great people to attract, you want to attract the best people, and you want to retain them as well. And I think the more recent work we've been doing has been finding that sometimes in social enterprises, there's a real emphasis on having meaningful work. So you can give people great meaning in their work because they're doing such great work. But you've also got to think, how can I actually make sure they have good working conditions? How the training is there? Are they bringing on, recruiting people from disadvantaged areas as well? And then are they creating the right support? Are they providing maternity protection, maternity for women who are pregnant? Do they get the support they need and the maternity leave that they can get as well, which is really difficult to do in running organizations when there is a lot of financial constraints, but it's all about how do we keep and retain the best people in the business. The fourth ingredient, I'd say, is continual innovation. And I think this is where social enterprises often can be seen as great experimenters. They sometimes having the freedom to actually explore new ideas, not being too tied to single funders, and having that freedom to do it. And if you do have that freedom, it's a great opportunity and something to cherish as well. I think to have innovation, you've also got to have the partnerships and the collaboration for that creativity. You want to bring people together who have different skills to you. You want to get that optimum balance of people who understand what you're doing, but also bring new ideas. So they're kind of different enough so that they have that. People who are too similar to you won't give you that creativity. People who are too distant from you won't get what you're doing and won't understand it. So you need people who just about understand. And then you need to have those importance of bringing your beneficiaries in as what I call co-producers, people so they can design together the services. And I think from this way, you've also got to think for innovations, how do you finance it? And this is where grants, I'll get onto later, are really important, because grants are there to help you do that innovation. But also you might need to put aside a bit of surplus from your other enterprises to make sure that there is that fund for innovation that you can do. Now, with innovation, social enterprises are a bit different to other private businesses. Conventional business, you might be very protective of all the competition of people who might be wanting to do similar things to you. But in a social enterprise, you might want to think, do I want to share my ideas more freely? Because your success is defined by more people having a social impact. So it might be that giving your ideas away might be the best way to maximize your impact. And then think about how you can move on to the next innovation, because you've always got to be thinking about how do you keep your own businesses solvent? How do you keep all your businesses going? So you don't want to give everything away, so you go bankrupt or out of business. But the best way to be is this idea of being what I call a serial innovator. So you're constantly innovating and moving on to next innovation, and then sharing that and moving on to the next. And that's why a social enterprise, and when you're telling your story to grant makers, one of the things you could show is that you can actually make these innovations. You can then share them more broadly, and then you can move on and to have further innovations. And this is where grant funders are really excited to work with those sort of social enterprises that can demonstrate that really big, impact. So we mentioned before, I heard the word scaling up coming up in the breakout rooms and the discussion from there. And this is a crucial bit. And here you can think through, how do you scale up your innovations? Do you grow within the organization, just employ more people, reach more services? Secondly, you could scale up through franchising and licensing. Do you find other social enterprises who want to use your idea and maybe work with you under licensing? And then thirdly, you might find your scaling up is just through sharing your ideas, disseminating your good practice, letting other organizations know what you're doing. You don't have so much control there. You may not have any income streams from giving them all the ideas away, but you could demonstrate that you're having this big impact. And maybe you need to find different of these three strategies. You could find what, you could run all three of them at different times or for different products and decide what's the best route. There's no one answer. So those are the main ingredients, but any recipe or any, if we're using the analogy of cooking, all recipes have to be more the ingredients. It's all about the method of putting it all together. And that's where, even when you've got all those things together, it's that ability of leaders to combine the social and environmental objectives with the commercial objectives. That's the crucial element. You've got to find your way of doing it. Often there's tensions in there. You might find at times you're under real commercial pressure to deliver the service, or you might find that you're under a lot of pressure from you might want to have more emphasis on the social and environmental objectives, and different people in the organization may have different views, and that's where good leaders and people and others within social enterprises, they have to navigate their way between these tensions. You want to have the working conditions to maximize the well-being for all, and then you've got to find ways of bringing all of this together, bring people together and making those new connections. So if we look at this, particularly on the need for grants here, this is where, as you're doing any grant applications and thinking through in any social enterprise is thinking through its long-term strategy, you've got to think through what is the best way to maximize that social impact and help it scale up. And this is where grants can come in. I wouldn't recommend organizations to be 100% reliant on grants, because that means you're a bit dependent. And particularly if you're reliant on one grant funder, you can have what I call the sort of cliff. You want to avoid the cliff edge, where you're going along, doing amazing work, suddenly the funding stops, you're off the edge of the cliff, and you have to close that activity down completely. You've got to think of a way of using grants to pump prime, to get support going, to get new business models running, and then to reach self-sufficiency. That can be the best way of using grants, to give you that. So you use the grant to get you up to a good high level, and then you can be find a way of being self-sustaining through other raising money through other social enterprise ideas. That's the optimum. It might be that you use grants to get up to a certain level and then have other grants to take it on, and so you constantly find new ways of continuing the work, but always trying to avoid that cliff where things might have to stop suddenly. You want to also use grants to bring in the best people. So it might be you get grants in to actually set up, to recruit and to appoint good people who can then become self-sufficient through other funding sources, so who can then generate more money through the social enterprise activity. And also the crucial thing for grants is driving innovation. Sometimes this innovation can be risky. It might be that it might work, it might not work. If you're using your own money, you might not be able to take that risk. So grant makers can come in and de-risk that investment of the new ideas. And the final element of funding is to attract further funding. And this is where, in finance terms, they call this leverage, where a bit of funding comes in, it grows, and then attracts other funding, whether it's other grants or other income. And if you can demonstrate to grant makers that the bit of money you're bringing in will leverage in even more money, grant makers love that, because they see they might be giving a small amount, but they can see it growing and attracting further funding. And it might be that you can get a bit of money from a grant, and then you can get further funding from, you might borrow it from other, might be borrowed money, because if you've got a good sustainable business model. So the grant funding can then help attract this other funding, attract the other finance, attract new business, and leverage up. And if you can tell that story to grant funders, they can then realize that your activity is having a much bigger social impact than many others because you're scaling up in that way. So just some of these issues, I'll be happy to answer any questions. There's an online course we might be running. We've been running it for a few years. It might be running again with some good examples from across Africa within that, as well as Latin America. But look, sign up for that, and I'm not sure quite when it's running next. But do be very happy to answer any questions.